Hello and welcome back to Lit Sahitya. Today we are discussing a very important essay by Nivedita Menon titled Between Burqa and the Beauty Parlor. So without wasting any time, let us get started. So at the beginning of the essay, Menon is talking about the blurred boundaries between tradition and modernity. She talks about the people who pose themselves as pro globalization and the same people who also take part or support anti globalization debates. Thus, the left wing anti globalization stance and the majoritarian right wing Hindu stance gets blurred while serving their own interest. So both the right wing and the left wing are using this issue to for their own good. So both this left and uh, right wing modify their stance according to the convenience and their interest. So Menon describes three major terms here, which are post-colonial modernity and our modernity. So Menon says that post-colonial does not merely mean after colonization. Rather, it represents the oppositionality, the resistance against the colonial interference. Post-coloniality thus begins from the very first moment of colonial contact. Menon adds that there are three processes in modernity that are generally understood. The first one is the capitalist industrial production. Second, political institutions of liberal democracy and the evolution of a society based on process of individuation. And the third, a gradual decline of communal forms of belonging yielding place to the modern form of interest-based voluntary associations. Menon explains that when the modernity which was constructed in the European societies entered India, which was through which was through colonization, it caused double violence in the colonies, considering the disruptive nature of modernity in Europe itself. The concept of our modernity was proposed by Partha Chatterjee. Tradition versus modernity. So, in this part, Menon points out that this modernity was not received uniformly meaning equally by everyone. Rather, the local elites and the subaltern groups had their own perception towards it, and also the level of adoption differed from group to group. Menon highlights that in countries which were formerly colonized generally oppose globalization or take anti-globalization stand in the name of saving the tradition and the nation, as though the nation has become the tradition. When it comes to nationalism, both the left and the right wing do not clearly demark their position, as they both intend to exploit this idea of nationalism for their own gain. Menon points out that the hypocrisy of people who exploit women in the name of tradition. She adds that it is always the women who are burdened to preserve the tradition, and whenever a threat to the tradition arises, it is always the women who have to bear the consequences. She gives the example of Mehbooba Mufti, a politician from Kashmir who used to speak for the freedom of women before she entered politics. But the moment she was in the government, she herself started wearing hijab, the very cause she was fighting against. Menon also expresses her views upon liberalization of Indian economy, where millions of Indians were exposed to the modern Western ways of clothing, food, and lifestyle. As a response, Hindu right organizations like Bajrang Dal and Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad try to enforce a dress codes for women in universities, claiming that the harassment would decrease if the women dressed more respectably and according to the Indian tradition. Similarly, several attempts have been made in the recent years to control women's dressing and behavior in the name of cultural purity. Menon mentions an organization in Kashmir named Lashkar-e-Jabbar who issued open threats to Muslim women that acid would be thrown on them if they are seen without the veil, that is burqa. And to identify which women are Muslim and which are of other faith, the organization issued another order to Hindu and Sikh women to wear a bindi to be spared from the attack. Menon points out through these examples how female bodies are marked with cultural signs. Menon asserts that communities uh, vest their honor in their women. When a community feels its identity or existence is under threat, then its proud assertion of identity is always marked on the bodies of its women first. For example, more women in Kerala started wearing burqa after the demolition of Babri Masjid in 1992. Menon then quotes two different women from their interviews to demark the fluidity of the concept of modernity, freedom, and oppression. On the one hand, women feel liberated to be able to go to the beauty parlor, saying that they now have the freedom to do what they like. And on the other hand, some women say wearing a burqa empowers them. They no longer have to care about how they look, and they feel much safer in public wearing the burqa. So Menon is presenting two different points here, uh, keeping in mind in the first one she is talking about the modernity, and the second point she is talking about the tradition. And in both of them can have different meaning for different people. Menon then points out that both the burqa and the beauty parlor have their vices. At the same time, they both can be liberative to particular women. One cannot clearly define one as good and the other as bad, as they both have a hidden agenda and multiple organizations working behind them to propagate their agenda in the name of tradition or modernity. So, in the next part, Menon is talking about a challenge has risen for the feminist. So thus Menon poses the challenge that arises from for the feminist politics, as on the one hand these right-wing forces oppose the Western products of Valentine's Day, ramp walks, beauty parlors, etc., in the name of preserving their tradition, that is the nation. And on the other hand, elites celebrate the free choice, individual freedom, women's rights to their bodies. But as questioned by Menon, do women really have free choice in the so-called modernity where their bodies are commodified and at a whole different level of politics goes on behind these flashy beauty pageants and Miss Worlds? Deconstructing binary opposites. Menon then deconstructs this notion that modernity and tradition are two binary opposite forces and cannot be intertwined. Menon says that modernity and tradition are not always clearly distinguishable. Menon adds that the people who call themselves traditional knowingly or unknowingly perform many tasks which are termed to be modern. Same goes with the people who identify themselves as pro modernity. The political groups too step outside their circle of tradition or modernity and at times mingle with each other whenever the situation demands them to do so. Menon also talks about Islamic feminism who stand in the defense of veil, that is the burqa or hijab, against the Western commodification of women and challenge the Western male gaze. The concept of third space. Menon then poses a third space where both these forces of tradition and modernity can be criticized simultaneously because they both possess elements which needs to be examined and debated. Beauty contests sponsored by multinational companies in third world countries often occupy contradictory positions on the grid of tradition modernity. In India, women from traditional middle to lower middle class families aspiring to beauty crowns and modeling as a career often escape patriarchal controls and live in their life of liberated, wealthy women. They are confident, have control on their earnings, and invest in a future in which they will no longer be models. The ideal they stand for in the winning round of beauty contest is that of Indian womanhood, which is represented as a perfect mix of tradition and modernity. Indian women started winning international titles all of a sudden in 1990s as the great Indian middle class was created in that decade. India opened up as a consumer market for multinational companies, which cosmetics especially specifically targeted at uh, Indian coloring and requirements. International beauty contests became a way of wooing hitherto untapped markets in Asia and Africa. The conscious strategy adopted by Satya Saran, the editor of Femina magazine, led to the selection of the international look, which was far from the Indian idea of beauty. Globalization can be seen as either empowering or oppressive, as it can be seen as a result of the societal expectations placed on contestants. In the next part, she talks about the migration of Bangladeshi women to the West and globalization. The complex negotiations between tradition and modernity is evident in the migration of Bangladeshi women from the global south to the north and the transformations of these relocated communities. Naila Kabir's book on Bangladeshi women workers addresses the paradox that women in Dhaka entered garment factories and work unveiled, while women in London are almost entirely confined to home working. This is due to the diverse geographical background of women in Dhaka and the concentration of Bangladeshis in East London. Kabir argues that globalization in garment factory, sweet shops empowers women despite exploitative work conditions. However, her argument misses a critical component: the two axes at work, tradition and modernity, and home and not at home, produce contradictory results. The critical distinguishing element is not the economic operation of globalization, which takes Bangladeshi immigrants to London as much as they bring women to the factories in Dhaka. Instead, it is the cultural hegemony produced by globalization that is more violently experienced in the West than in a poor country like Bangladesh. Even within Bangladesh, the reassertions of community would take place at the points where cultural hegemony is perceived as a threat, regardless of the anonymity produced by factory productions. Globalization as uniformly oppressive. Due to its compatibility with the politics of the Hindu right in India, Kumkum Sangari points out that both the defense of the beauty context by the Indian middle class and the opposition to the event from the Hindu right hinge on nationalism and carry an overt anti feminism. This close connection between the narrow understanding of political economy and the contradictory responses to beauty contest globalization becomes impossible for Sangari to sustain as the argument proceeds, as the contradictions are too many. The new middle class also forms part of the Hindu rights support base, and this is partly the reason why the prime minister leading the right wing coalition applauded the successes of Indian women in beauty contests. This fact is too easily dismissed by Sangari as a division of labor in Hindu right between moderate parliamentarians and smart and street smart vandals, with the former supporting structural adjustment and liberalization policies, while the latter maintains the myth of Hindu right-wing nationalist claims through overt opposition to some of its epiphenomenal forms. However, there is a division of labor in the Hindu right which works differently. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad and the Bajrang Dal generally focus on culture, while the Swadeshi Jagran Manch deals with economy. The CPIM led left front government in West Bengal has been proactive in inviting foreign capital and implementing all the structural adjustment policies required for this program to be successful. The complexities and contradictions in the attitude of the left towards globalization is something Sangari does not touch at all. The silence in her paper implicitly suggests that the left is really anti globalization as opposed to the hypocritical stance of the right. A more striking illustration of left wing nationalism as a response to globalization is the position taken by the governments of the third world developing countries on the social clause of GATT. The social clause attempts to impose social standards as a precondition to trade with the Indian government, denouncing the linking of labor standards to trade as an attempt to neutralize the third world's trade advantage of cheap labor. The picture of globalization in India is characterized by left and right wing governments succumbing to structural adjustment, nationalist protest against the social clause, and nationalist pride over the bomb. The left emerged in open opposition to the bomb only after Pakistan's reciprocal nuclear explosions. Sangari argues that the bomb and beauty context are rooted in feelings of relative deprivation, while the nuclear policy was not originated by the Hindu right, which has inherited a long-standing nationalist project of putting India on the world stage. It is not useful to understand the effects of globalization or right wing politics in India as a function of political economy alone, nor to assume that there is a pure anti globalization position on the left and a necessary compromised one on the right. The response vary from government to party uh, to trade union fronts of the left and right, and collapse the several distinct strands into two homogenized position is to lose a sense of the textured nature of globalization and its responses to it. Frederick Jameson's identification of five levels of globalization helps in taking an inventory of their ambiguities. Kancha Ilaiah suggests that globalization has opened up a new channel of hope for historically suppressed masses, the Dalit Bahujan, by allowing them to access English as a means of coming into contact with the world's egalitarian knowledge systems. Both Jameson and Elia offer the potential to complicate our understanding of globalization and its effects. Nationalism is only one of the platforms from which to counter the imperialism of corporate globalization, and it is not the most just or reproductive one. For attempting a radical critique of capitalism. In conclusion, a radical critique of capitalism and dominant patriarchal culture requires considering three dimensions: the complex nature of political subjectivities, the contradiction between our belief in the need to start, a need to assert and protect the autonomy of the individual citizen, and our simultaneous belief in operation of dominant power laden values that make freedom to choose problematic. Democracy, with its assumption of the right bearing citizen endowed with free will, poses a problem for us until the values we hold to be crucial are hegemonic in the society. The notion of universal human rights has become increasingly problematic, often linked to the United States of America as a global champion of universal human rights. In the new unipolar world, the question of universal rights appears in the form of an form of an unavoidable choice, barbarity or civilization. In public discourse, the debate is often seen in the terms of three positions: pro human rights, pro interventions by the US, and anti human rights, and pro religious fundamentalists, dictators, and those who don't care either way. In the context of negotiating the contradictions generated by globalization on the one hand and cultural nationalism on the other, the need for feminist politics simultaneously to deconstruct both the freedom of choice presented by the beauty parlor and the nationalist resistance to globalization offered by the burqa. In the process, we might end up using the idea of autonomy of the individual to challenge cultural nationalism, and conversely, using the idea of historical, temporal, and spatial specificities to challenge the homogenizing drive of globalization. The need for an uncompromising critique of the nation state is also essential. Frederick Jameson states that the nation state today remains the only concrete terrain and framework for political struggle. Despite the US coopting, co-opting the language of nationalism and using the language of universalism to defend its specific national self-interest. He recognizes that the universal and the particular are embedded as a contradiction within the existing historical situation of nation states inside a global system. So, nationalism is one of the earliest forms of identity politics, and it is not self evident that identity politics can only refer to smaller identities within the nation. The assumption is based on the assumption of a democratic and secular nationalism, which is not necessarily true. The nation can only represent dominant majoritarian values, and minorities cannot claim the legitimacy of representing the nation. The secular nation has historically constituted the citizen through anti democratic measures such as acculturation process in France. In the Indian context, secularist discourse has been intimately tied to a notion of development that sacrifices sectional interest in the favor of Indian citizen. This development model has benefited specific sections of society and regions, and struggles against marginalization have involved posing specific identities and particularity against the universalizing thrust on development discourse. The assumption of an essay link between anti imperialism and nationalism is problematic from the point of view of a democratic project. It is essential to be reflexive of the founding moment of discursive violence that presupposed and produced the nation, and the repressions and marginalizations of on which Hegemonic nationalist discourse is predicated. No project of nationalism is ever completed, as it is frozen at some point through a coercive apparatus backed by violence, preventing the further articulation of other vices and identities with similar aspirations. The demise of the nation state in the era of globalization is a myth, as the nation state is simultaneously being reconstituted in all its oppressive aspects and retreating from development and welfare responsibilities. This retreat is a proactive step, making it easier for global capital to penetrate with restrictive measures controlling labor mobility and trade unions. The delegitimization of the state's authority only pertains to positive effects generated in anti imperialist struggles while reinforcing negative repressive qualities associated with the state. The democratic response is complex and both turning to the nation state to reassert the old authority and celebrating globalization are misplaced. Corporate globalization's post nationalism from above seeks to bypass the sovereignty of the nation in the interest of global capital. Post nationalism should be described as from below, involving cross border solidarity movements for women's rights, minorities' rights, pro democracy, and peace movements. Critiques of multiculturalism often capture communities as constituted by fixed cultural boundaries, with gender often being one of the axes on which the assumed vitality of cultures is internally challenged. The problem is inadequate for liberal democracies to address the issue of respecting cultures whose attitudes of ethnic or racial superiority are antagonistic antagonistic or to other cultures. The vitality and identity of a community often depend on denying autonomy to sections within itself. Within a multicultural politics, recognition involves only external recognition by the state of different communities and by communities of one another. However, there are voices within the community that are critical of the marking of their women by the community in specific coercing ways. A feminist response to this mode of constituting the community must be mediated by a recognition of the complex dynamics involved, both of the threat to the minority identity in a multicultural society with a substantial majority community, and of the internal coercion involved in the constitution of this minority identity. This recognition of the complexity of cultural identity in a globalized world requires challenging both the uh, reification of cultural boundaries by advocates of multiculturalism and the unproblematic assertion of universal rights by its opponents. Critics of the reification of cultural communities should take the opposite direction towards a greater fracturing of universalism. Globalization is a complex articulation of differentiated, sometimes mutually contradictory processes that can produce spatially and temporally differentiated moments that generate constraint, constraint and freedom. A radical transformative politics cannot afford not to recognize the full significance and potential offered by this unpredictability. For instance, forces of globalization can work against those of the religious right, such as corporate India's opposition to the ethnic cleansing attempt by the Hindu right-wing government in Gujarat. Corporate globalization can also appropriate feminist slogans into traditional images of women. In the face of such complex intersections of the reactionary and progressive, there are no clear-cut strategies to offer. The clearest conclusion is that the other space that women seeks to define will have to be marked by the continual refusal of choice between tradition and modernity, between universal rights and cultural specificities, between individual uniqueness and community identity, between capitalist consumerism and demonization of desire. And that's it for this essay. Thank you so much for watching.